Hi.
Thanks for coming out.
Hi. Hi, guys.
Kyle Beachy has written an amazing book. He sent me an early copy, and I read it in like 2 days. He's going to read a little bit, and then we'll get into a conversation.
Yeah, I will. He's right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to read, really this is going to be, I think, 4 minutes. This is from a chapter called 7 Small Bafflements. Oh, and I have this for you. This is a sticker from Ted Barrow. It's a bafflement.
Thanks, Kyle.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Okay, this is bafflement number 2. What is a stage? At the corner of Chicago's Milwaukee and Fullerton Avenues, in the hot Logan Square neighborhood, sits Liberty Bank. To the immediate west of this building is a 34,000 square foot parking lot where I and others like me will go after normal banking hours. Speaking structurally, the only real appeal of the lot is the 10 parking blocks arranged into a rectangle beneath the Blue Line L tracks that slice diagonally across the space. Several of these blocks have been rub-bricked and waxed by us or others like us, and they're the most obvious thing to point to as the reason we come, though I'm not sure that's quite the right word. And come to do what? I will try to describe our practice. We gather along the perimeter and take turns moving determinedly for the blocks. We stray by arbitrary routes across the space, getting our legs warm, working through familiar movements. We make cautious early attempts at new movements. We watch the ways that everyone else moves and know that we too are being watched. We plug fingers into our ears when the trains thunder overhead, marking the city's time. We resist the basic assumptions of this and other cities. We fall, and the blacktop of the lot stains our palms, and we make eye contact with the others. So much of what we're doing, in fact, is watching. We stand or sit with our prior movements lingering in and about our bodies like an odor or glaze of sweat, a residual shimmering of the soul. We watch and laugh and applaud, and we recoil when someone fails, like there's a string between the failing body and our own. I am not being coy or only coy in avoiding the common name for this practice. To be honest, I fear the way its name will trigger assumptions of the very sort the practice aims to upend. It is a performance. Each human performer stands upon an individual stage that is elevated 4 inches or so from the pavement on wheels. As is common to theater, the performance that we are watching and that we are doing occurs in the body on the stage. Less common is the way that each body will manipulate the stage on which it stands. These manipulations, in fact, would seem to represent a radical mode of experimentation. For example, we regularly spin our stage a half rotation beneath our feet, like this. And you'll have to buy the book. There's a cool thing. Or a whole rotation like this. We flip the stage like this. In short, what we are doing is a theater of transgression and trespass. The architectural historian Ian Borden has written about our practice as participatory architecture, a system of behaviors that, quote, challenges the notion that space is there to be obeyed. The assumed normative purpose of the parking block, for example, is upended by our use of it. The language of theater allows us to go further. By engaging the block as we do, sliding and grinding our stages against it, we infuse the block with a new purpose. It too becomes a stage. Bafflement number 3, what do we fear? Adults fear death. This is why we invented literature. Children, unable to comprehend death, find a suitable surrogate in adulthood. Skateboarders, in the meantime, worry only over that apocalyptic moment after which we'll be forced to stop skateboarding. This we call terror. And I'll stop there. Bing.
I think in one of your past talks, you talked about how there's just kind of a lack of language for us to be able to talk about skating beyond things like, oh, that was rad, or that was cool. Can you talk about that a little bit more and like how that figured into you writing this book about skateboarding?
Yeah. I think anyone who has done skateboarding or who has been around skateboarders or engaged in like the conversations of skateboarding will agree that like the best thing to say, basically like the best and most rewarding thing to point out is when something is rad. It's like, wow, that's great. And it's not just that you're celebrating the thing, you're also sort of celebrating yourself for seeing the thing. And so it would make sense that rad is, or great, or dope, or sick, or tight, or like all the variations we have of saying like this thing that I just witnessed is good. There's a sort of way that sort of stops. The conversation ends there. It's like you celebrate the thing that you've seen, and then you prepare for the next thing in a certain sense. And I think there's not a lot of interest, or there hasn't been a lot of interest in really kind of unpacking like why a thing is great, or like what is it about the thing specifically that is so great. It's sort of this kind of it's fun to agree with someone. Like, hey, you and I both just witnessed this. Wasn't that great? Yeah, that was great, right? Like that's the sort of there's a sort of very small community that's created there when you're both celebrating the thing. And I think because of that, there hasn't been a real sort of pressure to unpack what exactly is going on, why it's going on, or maybe why this thing is a little bit more interesting than this other thing. I think generally speaking, we enjoy celebrating the thing and letting it sort of live there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's another, I'm not sure if it's a bafflement, but there's another part in the book where you talk about like, where you question sort of like, where does skateboarding begin and end, right? Does it begin when I pick up the board from beside my door and go out? Does it begin when I do my stretches in the morning? Like, are we skateboarding right now? Is this skateboarding as well? Like, can you talk about that a little bit too?
Yeah, sure. I think the answer, provocatively, I think the answer is yes. I think what we're doing here is probably part of skateboarding. I guess that sort of starts with the fact that a good deal of what skateboarding is watching. Like you see each other, you want to be seen. Skateboarding alone is unsatisfying for a number of reasons, and primary among them is the fact that like you're not being witnessed, right? You're not part of the sort of reflexive or symmetrical practice of perception. And I think the second that you sort of accept that watching is a big part of skateboarding is the second that you start to look at like, well, what else then is part of skateboarding? And a big part of it is talking, right? I mean, as sort of simple as that conversation I just outlined is, like, oh, that's rad, or like, oh, that's super cool what just happened, that itself is like that mutuality, that sort of community that's created out of that shared celebration, that is central, it seems to me, to why people skateboard, right? I mean, there's this big question about what it is that we're doing when we ride a skateboard. And it's, you know, at a basic level, the question is like, is it an art or is it a sport? Is it corrosive to society, or is there a way that skateboarding can serve as a tool for social good? And I think these are all really important questions. But I don't know that we can really have serious conversations about those big questions until we actually start looking at what actually constitutes the verb skateboarding. And so one of the things I get into here is that, well, you know, maybe we should start looking at the practices around it, talking about it, watching it, moving toward it, like gravitating around it and occupying a shared space where someone is skateboarding, but you're not, right? I mean, you know this, that a great deal of what it means to go out skateboarding for a day is sitting there and watching other people ride their skateboards. And it's not like you like tune out. It's not like when you sit down, you stop being a skateboarder. It's actually that the process of skateboarding includes sitting down. And it includes sitting there, and it includes chatter. It includes like filming a clip and sharing it. Like all of that is skateboarding. And so, you know, if we want to take the case of us up here on this really nicely carpeted or rugged stage, like, yeah, you and I met through skateboarding. You and I are here as the sort of culmination of a series of conversations you and I have had about skateboarding. And so if we can't be here without skateboarding, I don't know that there's a way to envision this without incorporating skateboarding into it.
I want to get into the question of like how can skateboarding be used for the purpose of social good. There is a chapter in The Most Fun Thing about the Picasso statue at Dealey Plaza and how it was a donation from the artist to the city to quote, I might be misquoting, but use however the citizens may wish to. Yeah. And so one of the things that a lot of skateboarders do in the city is they go and attempt to get tricks on this statue. And you've got a trick that you've been trying that's sort of been your nemesis trick for a while, right? A wall ride shove. You just haven't been able to really get clean. But what happens is you go to this spot and there's a security officer or two sitting in the lobby of the Dealey Plaza, and they come out usually within 5 to 10 minutes. Sometimes you get lucky and you get more. Is skateboarding somehow a sort of like kinetic way of critiquing public space and our use of it, and who gets to use public space and in what ways? And to put that into further context, there is a skate video that Illegal Civ put out a year ago, and there was 2 little snippets of. So it's common practice in skate videos for for footage of security guards kicking out skateboarders and skateboarders like arguing or sometimes fighting back. But in this Illegal Civ skate video, one of them was he was going to perform in the Olympics. And so his justification was like, well, I'm out here practicing. And I have corporate sponsors who are paying me to get footage so that I can make a paycheck in order so I can make a living. How does this all figure into this conversation about specifically, can skateboarding be used as sort of a kinetic critique of public space and our use of it?
Okay, yeah, so there's a lot there, and I think probably a place to start maybe at getting at some of that stuff is acknowledging that the relationship we have to public space, shared public space in the US is not like some natural thing, right? Like if you were to travel to Scandinavia, they have a very different relationship to public space. If you were to spend time in Bordeaux, France, you would find a very different relationship to public space. So it seems to me that our relationship to public space here in the US is largely rooted in the sort of mythology of litigation. That if someone harms themselves on private property, the owners of that property are responsible for it, right? They can be sued for whatever injury has occurred. And there's a long sort of, boogeyman story about we have to kick you out of this spot because if you hurt yourself, you could sue us, and so on. In the history of the United States of America, there have been, I think, like 2 or 3 lawsuits ever of that sort. So it's not a common thing that ever happens, but it is sort of used as this justification for why there's obviously no skateboarding on private property. Now, on shared public property, it's a little different, right? I mean, I don't want to get super deep into Marxist ideology yet, but it does seem to me that there is a way that the security guard and the skater should not be posed as opposite figures in this, right? That in fact, somewhere like Dealey Plaza, somewhere with a beautiful and world-renowned piece of public art, that anyone who has ever been there who is above the age of 2 has wanted to scale the Picasso statue at Dealey Plaza. It's fun. And not only is it fun, but it's impervious to any sort of damage, right? It's forged steel, fortified in Gary, Indiana. There is nothing that anyone in this room together, if we all teamed up, could possibly do to the Picasso statue in Dealey Plaza. And yet, one of the hard and fast and rigid rules of Dealey Plaza, and it's right there on the website, you don't have to be an archivist to know these things, is that there are no wheeled structures allowed anywhere near it. Kids can run up it and slide down it. You can have your quinceañera photos on it. You can rent the whole thing out for a wedding. It's $12,000 a day if anyone's curious about what it costs to rent Dealey Plaza. I don't know if that's 24 hours or 12, but it's 12 grand. But what you cannot do is put wheels anywhere on it. And I think because the U.S. has, to kind of try to tie this back together, because the U.S. has the relationship we have to the idea of public space not really being public, right? The idea of public space as being somehow owned by someone, that probably somewhere beyond is an owner, and the owner wouldn't like us doing that thing. We have a tendency, and anyone here who skates will know this, of kind of self-policing. And so one of the stories I tell in the chapter on the Picasso statue is a story of me going there with my buddy Zach, who's here, and another friend of ours, and essentially being told to leave not by security guards, but by the public, who were insistent that we were doing something wrong. And I don't say this as if it's an aberration. I mean, the general idea within the United States is that skateboarding is wrong, that it shouldn't be done in certain places. And with the rise of skate parks, in addition to having a whole lot of new resources for people to ride on skateboards, we also now have, as a kind of backdoor rhetorical device, we have now a much stronger argument for why people shouldn't ride skateboards in public. Well, you have these parks. Go to these parks. We've given you these parks. Why can't you just use the parks? But the fact is that riding a skateboard in a skate park is not the same experience as riding it through the city. And if there's an argument to the most fun thing, one of the arguments is that, in fact, what we are doing when we are engaging with the city is actually very, very interesting. For the city, for us, for the kind of texture of what it means to share space with each other as human beings. And so when I hear you ask about like security guards, what I immediately think is like, yeah, it's really too bad the amount of kind of collisions that you see between skaters and security guards. And it's one thing when it's private property and it's the Bank of America Tower, Chase Park Plaza with those exceptional ledges a few blocks from here, an incredible place to ride a skateboard. It's too bad when the multinational banking corporation doesn't want us skating there. But it's quite another thing, it seems to me, when it's a public place that we all pay for in Daley Plaza, and still there's this kind of conflict of interests. And so one of the questions I ask is like, what is it? What is it that skateboarding does in a shared place that people are so, upset by? It's that it's loud. It's that there is the potential that the board rolls out and hits someone in the shin, which is a terrible thing to have happen. It's the worst feeling in the world when your board rolls out and hits someone in the shin. But beyond that, I think there's also this sort of idea in the US that like you shouldn't be doing it here, and I'm going to be a good citizen to stop you from doing it. Now that doesn't exactly get into the question of like, can skateboarding be a social good? But I think it is one of the hurdles in terms of the perception of what skateboarding is and how people relate to it.
Kyle is one of a few skaters that are on a podcast called Vent City, where they get into all things skateboarding and beyond. But they did an episode where they critiqued the film The Lords of Dogtown. And one of their critiques of that film was, the many tropes within which it exists, which is, I feel like typically skateboarding narratives fall into coming of age or competition narratives. The most fun thing is a nonfiction book of essays strung together with, I would argue, a very autobiographical narrative built into it. And you've talked about how this book came out of the process of struggling with a fiction story about skateboarding to a certain extent. Can you talk about that?
Struggle?
I guess the struggle of making narratives that involve skateboarding.
Yeah. I don't know that it's necessarily all that different than like the struggle of making narratives out of martial art, or the struggle of making narratives out of yoga, or the struggle of making narratives out of cooking. But it does seem to me that most of what we have when it comes to skateboarding films is skateboarding kind of being wrapped around a familiar narrative, like a fish out of water narrative, or like stranger comes to town narrative. I think of the movie Airborne, which isn't a skateboard movie. It's a rollerblade movie, actually, from Cincinnati. But it feels pretty like representative of the way that extreme sports are kind of treated, right? Like, let's take a familiar narrative, but let's slap a bunch of extremity onto it. And so it seems to me that the number of stories, the kind of selection of stories that use skateboarding in a slightly more organic or endemic way, find narratives that come from within skateboarding rather than sort of wrapping a familiar narrative with this sort of extreme fluorescent skate wrapping paper. It just hasn't really happened much. And I'm going to get to you in a second because I think you actually did it in a really beautiful way. But yeah, I mean, the challenge was, and the kind of failure that birthed this book, and this book is in many ways about failure, the kind of key failure that led to this book is the fact that I wanted to write a novel that wasn't familiar, that was a little bit more honest and true to the sort of movements, the iterations, the cycles, the redundancies that define what skateboarding is. That rather than carving a kind of line with exposition and then a rise toward a climax, and then at the end everyone is changed, what I wanted to do was see if there was a way that skateboarding itself could provide a narrative structure, or a narrative form. And that got me into all kind of narrative weeds, and it got me really, really stuck, and it led to me kind of banging my head up against the wall in some key ways. And key ways that are not unique to skateboarding, right? Skateboarding is a process of repeated failure. When one succeeds on a skateboard, it's a kind of minor miracle. However, as a writer, I had a really difficult time handling this. I didn't know exactly what to do. You encounter failure enough times as an artist, and you start to doubt yourself. You start to doubt the time you've already put in. You start to doubt the process of, or the prospect of future time. It can be dark. It can be very, very dark. And so at a certain point, when I ran out of kind of options for writing the narrative, the novel, I found myself writing these essays. And the incredible thing about an essay, I don't know how many people in this room are writers, but the beauty of the essay form is that, of course, it encourages iteration. It encourages tangents. It encourages experimentation. There's no burden in an essay that if you go in a direction, that direction has to lead you to some sort of destination. I mean, it's probably the closest that we have to lyrical poetry in the prose form is the essay. And so when I found that actually a lot of the things I wanted to do with writing about skateboarding I could do with essays, it was a moment of just like profound relief and joy and artistic excitement for me. Because now I realized, like, oh, I was in the wrong like aisle of the supermarket. It's like, where's the ramen? It's like, well, why are you in the bread aisle? Like, go to the ramen aisle. So I was in the totally wrong sort of form. And yeah, I do think that there's something about skateboarding that demands circles and that demands nonlinear modes of thought. I mean, skateboarding is truly, among like whatever else it is a waste of time. It is inefficient. It is inefficient movement. And so, when I would send out pieces of the book and editors or agents would say, like, gosh, it just seems like you're wasting a lot of time, or more or less. It's like, well, yeah, of course I am. That's the idea. So I'd like to ask you a question. Do you consider Minding the Gap a coming-of-age story? Or when you think of the genre of your profoundly beautiful film, Minding the Gap, do you think of it as a story? Do you think of it as an essay? Where do you think it falls?
Yeah, I think it's a story. I think it's a coming of age story, but I also think it's a coming of age story in the same way that like a real estate agent would call a certain part of Chicago like West Bucktown. It's like it's just the demands of like what you have to, the language you have to learn how to speak in order to work in what is ultimately a business, right? And I'm curious like where you're headed next, actually, in terms of what you want to work on now and are you going to go back to the ramen aisle and try to, or go back to the bread aisle and
yeah.
you know, try to pick up that novel that birthed this?
I think one of the things that could happen is it could be that having spent 10 years and 300 pages talking about skateboarding here, that the novel that I was trying to kind of force would be a little liberated. Like if I were to go back to the novel, which exists and which I love, and which is, I acknowledge a deeply flawed artistic object. If I were to go back to that and kind of remove the burden of saying something about skateboarding, I imagine that there could be an interesting story there. I have all sorts of personal kind of qualms and fears about going back into that place. Because again, like I talk about this with my students all the time. I'm a professor at Roosevelt up the street University, Roosevelt University. And I teach in the MFA program, and I also teach undergrads in, kind of everything from intro to creative writing to like the essay and fiction writing and so on. And I do, I do a pretty aggressive job of making sure that we are always keeping failure pretty close to the front of our conversation, right? That we're not thinking of what we're doing as making a successful thing. What we're thinking about doing is like engaging a process. And so on that sense, like it's a strange thing to find myself saying these things in class, but then at home while I'm working on the book, just feeling like dark and morose, like, oh my God, I failed. Like, what am I doing? And so it took me a long time to kind of remember, like, no, listen to skateboarding. Skateboarding reminds us that failure is okay, and so on. Which is all to say, like, I have some real hesitations about going back into this art object project that took me into such a dark place. Like, I don't know that I want to particularly go back there.
Do you ever feel that like morose, dark place out of a failure in skateboarding, or is it
Never.
only? Okay.
Never. Like you go a little haywire. You'll have temper, and you'll express that temper. You'll scream. What else will you do? I don't know. I mean, you'll break. And on the worst case scenario, you break your board. But I don't feel the same sort of. I guess the word is pressure. But I think it's actually more interesting than being depressurized. Like, I think actually when I'm riding a skateboard, I expect failure. And anything that isn't failure to me feels like a tiny little miracle. Like, oh, I lucked into this thing. And so it's not just pressure, it's about expectation. It's about external expectations, right? I mean, I have expectations. My university has expectations for me as a professor. Like, in order to get tenure, I had to publish X number of pages and so on. And so it could just be that as a skateboarder, I care only about my own sort of standard of what defines success. But I do think, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't have written this much about the book if I didn't think that there was something else going on with skateboarding. I think there is something else that can be useful for us to think about in terms of failure that skateboarding offers.
I mean, do you think it has to do with like how we measure good writing, say, versus good skateboarding? And that's, obviously a subjective thing that's happening in our heads, but.
I think one of the key things here to keep in mind, though, is also the distinction between writing and publishing, right? I mean, what I wanted to do was not just write a skateboarding book. I wanted to publish a skateboarding book. And more to the point, I wanted to publish a skateboarding book in such a way that I got paid for it. Right? It's not as if I had a vision of an art object and I pursued that vision, I achieved that vision, and then I had the sort of wherewithal to say, okay, now I'm going to self-publish it and put it into the world, right? I mean, I voluntarily entered into the system of large-scale corporate publishing. And maybe that's where the sort of conflict came in, right? That a big part of me wanted to continue to be in the sort of echelon of New York publishers when the object that I was actually making was much stranger and much less kind of a commercial commodity. It could be.
What were some of the responses from the industry that you're getting about the book? That were...
Oh, they're terrible. I mean, they weren't terrible. They were hard. They're hard things to hear. I mean, I had an agent who had like been sort of off and on pursuing me because I put out a novel in 2009 that did okay. And since then, I had like agents and editors who would always like, you know, say the thing of like, hey, you know, if you've ever got a thing, let me know. And so finally I had the thing and I let them know. And it was just like, it was either crickets or it was like, I think you've tried too hard. And trying too hard is like, you know, that's what you get on like internet comments. You know, you publish the article and then the internet comments are like, oh, this is trying too hard. But to hear that from a big New York powerful agent, it was devastating. Because it was like, yeah, I've been trying exceptionally hard. So again, you know, I think it really was a kind of miscalculation in terms of what my project was. Because I will say that the 6 months that I spent writing this book, once it was under contract and the sort of essays that had been published already were kind of accepted as a manuscript, and the editor said, okay, now we need you to write about twice as much. That 6 months was the most joyful and frictionless and wonderful artistic output I've ever had. So it's not skateboarding's fault. Right, and it's not publishing's fault. It's something in my idea of what I was up to and who might be interested in that. I mean, I'd happily send you the book if you want to read it.
Sure.
It's pretty miserable.
If you want.
Yeah.
This is very personal. There's a thread that, you know, feels, and this is the narrative part that I feel really holds you know, a drive or whatever you want to call it. What was it like getting so personal in the book? The sort of trajectory of these essays. So I wrote the first one of these in 2011, and the idea there was to be as kind of distantly critical in a kind of objective art critical sense, right? To pull myself out of it and observe the thing and write analytically about it and write insightfully about it. Like basically hold up a skateboard movie to this sort of gaze that we hold up an art show or a work of literature or a piece of cinema. Because again, this is not a conversation we've generally had about skateboard movies, right? I mean, this is a cinema that has been variously DIY and grassroots and corporately sponsored since basically as the age of VHS cameras. We have been making, as a nation, we have been making this kind of cinema, this underground skateboard cinema. But they haven't been subjected, those objects haven't been subjected to the same kind of critical lens. And so my thought was, okay, I'm going to be critical about these. I'm going to look closely at these. I'm going to talk about what's there. I'm going to talk about what it means. And I'm going to do it from a distant sort of perch of the critic. And so I did a number of these, and then I kind of quickly found myself becoming more and more of the criticism, which, of course, criticism in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years has become more and more subjective, right? Like the sort of autobiocritical stance has become more and more acceptable. And so part of it was probably that, like the conversation was sort of changing. And it just sort of happened that I kind of began bleeding into the pieces I was writing. Until eventually, like, you know, the fact that I myself am a skateboarder and I myself am struggling with age and I myself wonder what skateboarding is about became kind of central to the late pieces. And so there's on one hand a kind of very real trajectory from critical into personal, and then on the other hand there's the fact that I was going through some key struggles that it seemed to me skateboarding had something to do with. And one of those was the artistic struggle of trying to write a novel. Another one of those was aging, as my body kind of got creakier and achier and so on, and questions of my own kind of
end of skateboarding prospects getting nearer and nearer. And then also I went through some very real marital struggles. And the person who was my best friend and became my wife, at some point became potentially my future ex-wife. And that was a really, really, again, kind of dark period, but one that I think overlapped kind of neatly with the kind of questions I was asking about skateboarding and about failure. Like, what does it mean to fail in a marriage? Like, what is a marriage? What are we doing? Why is it that the two of us becoming married suddenly changed our relationship to each other? And so, all of this, again, like, filters into this broad definition of what skateboarding is. And so the kind of invitation or the request that this book is asking, I think, of any reader is, okay, believe for a few moments that skateboarding might not be what you think it is. Believe that there might be something going on in skateboarding that goes on in other art practices. And from that, if we can accept that skateboarding is maybe bigger or broader or more interesting than we've given it credit for since the 1960s, nuisance, the kind of stock stoner character who doesn't do his homework, that's what skateboarding is. Like, what if it's not that? What if it's like these other practices? And then it becomes a question of like, okay, how does this practice relate to such things as marriage or aging or the aging of my parents or my own kind of fears of mortality and so on? And so by the end, there's very little distinction there between what I'm writing about and where I fit into it.
What does the future of writing look like? As someone who teaches writing and is connected to us in a certain sense to the up and coming generation, like, how are those writers concerned with different things than perhaps what you might have been concerned with when you were their age?
Well, I think there's a lot less of an idea that to be serious, one has to be a novelist. Like, that was my big flaw. Like, 22-year-old me decided I want to be a serious writer, and that means writing novels. And not only writing novels, but writing novels of ideas. Novels that are smart and satirical and ironic and darkly humorous and about contemporary society and mostly realistic, but then a little bit off. That was my idea. Like, that's what serious literature is. And I don't see that idea surviving at all anymore. Like, I don't see that from my students. I think my students tend to be way more inclined to multi-genre work and hybrid work. And of course, fiction has kind of moved itself from the realm of purely creative fictional worlds and into the world of the author, right? I mean, the most kind of compelling literature, it seems to me, one strain, I won't say most, one strain of compelling literature we have today is the sort of autofictive world where the author's experience becomes central to the creation of whatever the story is. And I think you just see a lot more of that. Like, I think, a lot more of my students are inclined to writing that is based on themselves. And not like feeling ashamed of that and not trying to, camouflage that. The challenge of that, of course, is that it leads to all sorts of blurring among my students of like the line between fiction and nonfiction. And we've seen a number of kind of debates in the last 5 years of where that goes wrong. And so I don't know. I mean, I feel like my sort of jobs as a professor to new generations of writing, or an instructor or a mentor of whatever sort I am, is to kind of serve as a kind of reminder that there is a distinction between the fictional and the real, and that there is an advantage to thinking about these two things as distinct. I don't know, because it gets really messy. It gets really messy and it gets really problematic. And so I guess the sort of short answer here is that I've had a lot of really messy workshops with students. I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it does demand us to have some frank and better conversations with each other about what art means and what we expect out of it.
Messy because, how are they messy?
I don't know. This gets into. I don't want to overstep too much into this, but certainly, like one of the ways that it gets messy is that there are these questions about, well, essentially morality, right? I mean, we have a certain kind of internal system as readers for what we expect out of fictional books and what we expect out of all of these works that aren't fiction. And it's not a really great time if you are an artist who likes to tread into immoral or amoral realms. It's not exactly celebrated right now to explore the amoral or the immoral. And I think a lot of that comes down to our kind of question of like, well, what is creative and what is actually the person fitting into the work, right? Like, because if it's the person who's in the work and the work is amoral or immoral, then we judge the person who's made the work. But if there's a line between fiction and non, and the person is making fiction that explores in some way the amoral or the immoral, I don't know how interesting any of this really is, but it does seem to me that I know firsthand that it leads to some messes.
I'm curious, like, why the audience is here. Like, who is here for the skateboarding talk? And who's here for the writing, literature talk portion? Maybe we're dipping too much into the literary writing thing. But I do have one more. I just want to nerd out a little bit longer, but one more question longer. Like, how much do you notice your students caring, and how much do you care after having gone through these processes about narrative, like, you know, in the traditional sense of, you know, hero's journey, Jungian archetypes, all that stuff? Like, does it matter? Do people care about it? What is the future of that?
I think that's interesting. I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it starts for me with a conversation of, is what you're trying to do a narrative project, or are you doing something else? Like, is your interest here, student, is your interest here in creating an energetic sequence of causes and effects where characters are driven by desires and they confront obstacles to those desires, and through navigating those desires and those obstacles, they find themselves at the end of this period changed in some key way? Like, are you doing narrative? Or are you doing something else? Like, are you interested in asking questions? Are you interested in repetition? Are you interested in iterations? Are you interested in the sonic quality of language and creating beauty? And you have no interest whatsoever in narrative and change and desires and obstacles. And I think that seems to me to be a much more fruitful place to start, rather than, is this true or is this imaginary? And so I don't know. I mean, I know that framing the conversation in those ways, framing the conversation as questions of narrative and then other questions, right? Like lyric, interests in sound qualities, interests in the sort of aesthetics of words on the page, as opposed to character moves through obstacles and finds themselves changed. Like, I think when you give students those options, often what I see in my students, and it would be different at the Art Institute, it would be different at Columbia College, it would be different at the University of Chicago, et cetera. What I find in my students is a sense of liberation. Right? I mean, story is kind of our ground floor entryway into creative writing, I think, for most of my students. And so when you give them the kind of potential, like, well, look, there are all these other things we can do that aren't story, I think I see a lot of kind of nascent, early stage excitement. I have no idea what that means for the future of writing or the future of my job. I have no idea. But I do know that there is a lot of interest these days in exploring non-narrative forms.
Okay, I'm going to switch back to skateboarding now, because I feel like one of the pieces that I think you're really well known for is writing this piece about Jason Jesse. And it's a piece about someone who made very racist remarks and has never really been held to task for it, and, you know, was sponsored by Converse and these other companies. And the article you wrote trying to examine why that is was not published in many of the major skateboarding outlets that most skateboarders read. Can you talk about that? Can you just unpack that for perhaps some of the people who don't know about that article or about that person?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, it's the worst way to talk about it probably is to say that there was a professional skateboarder who got canceled. Like, I don't think that's the most interesting encapsulation of what has happened. Early in, I suppose, 2019, there was a video project released by Converse. So it was a big budget footwear skateboard video. And the final part of this skateboard video was given to this sort of aging former pro named Jason Jesse, who has kind of found his way back onto the scene. And a kind of minor caveat of this is that every footwear company that you can think of, Nike, Adidas, Cons, have an interest both in attracting new young skateboarders to their product, but also in finding people who will serve as brand ambassadors to people like me and people like my friends here who are not young and who have interest in nostalgia and who are subject to nostalgia. And so what Cons did was find an aging skateboarder who had been a pro and who was a sort of locus of nostalgia for people like me. Adidas has a guy named Mark Gonzalez. Nike has a guy named Lance Mountain. Vans footwear has everyone else from like Steve Caballero to Christian Hosoi, people who were very famous in the 80s. So Cons decides their guy is going to be this guy, Jason Jesse. And so Jason Jesse has the final part, the sort of like ender, the caboose, the load-bearing part in this Converse video. He also has the cover of Thrasher magazine, which is like tops in the world of skateboarding. To land a cover of Thrasher magazine, monthly magazine, is a very big deal. And so this guy reemerges from kind of the depths of, I don't know, non-skating and is pulled back into the industry. The problem is that this is a guy who has a lot of, a pretty dark record of saying some fairly hideous things. And so there was a kind of exposure of some of those hideous things that he said in the 90s and some of the art that he's made. And none of it was good. None of it looked good. So, you know, the contemporary language for this is that it was bad optics. For me, personally, as someone who's been riding a skateboard since 1986, it was less about optics and it was more a real sense of betrayal. Because what I've been doing as a skateboarder since 1986 is buying a whole lot of skateboard crap, like nonstop. Like stickers and shoes and boards and grip tape to go on the boards and bearings and wheels and little rubber things to go into the trucks that hold the wheels and little pieces of plastic to add to the skateboard. I've spent thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars into the skateboard industry. And then the industry, once these things were uncovered about Jason Jesse and there was some uproar about it, were just, again, crickets, just silence. Because the skateboarding industry didn't, at the time, in the last sort of 5 years, didn't have the sort of infrastructure to really care for itself, to self-police and self-govern. And there are all sorts of reasons for why that was, but for me, as a skateboarding consumer, I felt extremely disappointed and I felt angry. And so what I ended up writing, to Bing's question, was a pretty angry article about the industry and about the failures that seemed to be visible with their lack of reckoning with this guy, Jason Jesse's hideous language and hideous artwork and essentially who he was. And yeah, I was just really, really mad. And I'm a slow writer. I'm not an efficient writer. Like, back to the efficiency thing. I'm an incredibly inefficient writer, but I wrote this article in a weekend. And I sent it off to a magazine who had published a lot of my stuff, and they sat on it. They kind of gave me a sort of bit of a runaround about why they couldn't publish it. But the fact is that in skateboarding, there is no independent journalism. Skateboard magazines are funded by the companies who buy ad space on their pages. And this magazine was funded by Converse. And so they were, whether officially or off the record or whatever, it was pretty clear from the get-go they were not going to publish this thing. So as often happens, the sort of way that the story comes into the world becomes part of the story, and the fact that it was sort of blacklisted by this, or they wouldn't publish it. Another magazine, a Canadian magazine, did then publish it, and then within 12 hours took it down because some people in the skateboard industry had complained about it, and everyone knows each other in the skateboard industry. It's a very small industry, and so it was published, and then it was pulled down, and then at this point it becomes like this forbidden samizdat, like, you know, like illicit piece of journalism. And then an English magazine by the name of Free Skateboard Magazine, ironically or not, picked it up and they ran it, and it became a kind of big hit because the fact is that the industry needed to have a reckoning. It was long overdue. And I think, you know, this kind of circles us back to the conversation about if skateboarding can be a social good. Like, it certainly could not be a social good as long as those same people were in charge of a very small industry. And one of the things that's happened since then, not due to the article, but because there's been a kind of critical mass of new people riding skateboards, new people starting skateboard companies, the sort of small core of power that's been, you know, housed in Santa Cruz, California, has kind of lost a lot of their power, and it's become a much more diverse place. And so, yeah, if skateboarding is going to be a social good, which it has, I think, a radical potential to be a social good, a kind of vehicle for social change, both on the kind of structural level and the individual level, it had to address these kind of skeletons in its closet. And I think it in large part has since then.
Are we allowed to do Q&As or no?
I don't think we are. I think it's against
Chicago Humanities
COVID.
Festival.
Yeah, it's COVID.
Okay.
COVID.
I'm going to talk about then, since we only have 8 minutes left, the future of skateboarding. So I know on your book tour you've been asked a lot about the Olympics because skateboarding has entered the Olympics for the first time amongst other quote-unquote extreme sports. What does that say about, I mean, so you've talked about how, you know, I think to the lay person's eyes, you know, if they see if they're exposed to skateboarding in this day and age, it is often through things like the Olympics or other, you know, high profile contests, like broadcasted contests. And you've said that, you know, that is, those people that you're probably seeing there are more linked to athletes, you know, more linked to people who go and train, you know, and literally do practice in order to try to, you know, win at something, you know, whether it's a purse of money or more, whatever. For kids who are, you know, for all the thousands and millions of kids who are exposed to those skateboarders and looking to them as idols, should we be concerned at all about that, or are the things that, you know, you find so valuable about skateboarding, the failure, you know, the inefficiency, are those gonna survive no matter what? I mean, can you talk about? Yeah,
no, I think that's a great maybe place to wrap things up. Like, there's a link between storytelling and sport, right? I mean, whether it's our love for story that shaped our sport or the creation of our athletics, it is certainly true that the way that we celebrate and write the history of athletics is through story, right? The two are intimately linked. Baseball, it's a long season. Football, the clock winds down, and so that climactic last sort of drive down the field is like at this fever pitch. It's like the closest you can come to a sort of narrative climax possible. And our heroes, our sports heroes, are those that shine in these moments of climax, right? Tom Brady is Tom Brady, for better or worse, because he does really well in the last few minutes of football games. That writes the story of him. And so there are some key ways that athletics relies on narrative. It seems to me that skateboarding becoming an athletic event that it did this year officially on a world stage and becoming part of the Olympics is both totally natural to the fact that skateboarding has always had a relationship to competition. it only made sense that as skateboarders got better, there would be people interested in showcasing these really good skateboarders for larger audiences, framing those showcases as athletic events, and, you know, building an audience, selling tickets, and, you know, doing the things that sport industry does. So on one hand, it makes total sense that that would happen. On the other hand, it seems to me almost impossible to deny that athletic skateboarding is the least interesting form of skateboarding that one could possibly come up with. It is just simply not, it's like tapping into about 4% of what skateboarding is, the success of it, and then judging one person's success against another. So my only concern about the Olympics, which are really kind of minor, is that sort of what you described, that as someone sitting in, I don't know, the Basque country in Spain, a young person sees the Olympics and from that is compelled to get a skateboard, and their parents compel them into a skateboarding program that gives primacy to competition. And then that person's experience of skateboarding is going to be rooted in that idea of competition and athletics. That to me would be a shame, because there's so much, as you know, there's so much more about skateboarding that has nothing to do with athletics, that has nothing to do with this person better than this person, and has everything to do with this incredibly nuanced and beautiful network of mutual support and community, and essentially like uplifting. Like skateboarding is just exceptionally beautiful, and in some key ways exceptionally anti-capitalist in its beauty, in that there's no scarcity. I mean, when I go skating with my friends, it doesn't matter that we all know that Zach's the best one there. Like, that's okay. Any sort of shadow of like who wants to be the best is like checked at the parking lot door. It doesn't matter. And I don't know how many people in this room have something like that in your lives. I don't know if you get that from friendship. I don't know if you get that from an art practice. I don't know if you get that from dance class, you know, on the weekends. I think of my grandmother going dancing once a week. Like, I don't know where you find it. But I know that for me, that sort of outlet of non-competitive, anti-scarcity, communal support has been an absolute life-saving part of my existence. And so my only concern about skateboarding becoming athletic is if that athletic sort of strain is given too much of a microphone and it ends up sort of ignoring all of the other things.
Do you think the anti-capitalism is inherent in skateboarding, or is it something that people always have to fight for?
No, I don't know that it's inherent in skateboarding. I mean, skateboarding is also an exceptional way to sell products. You know, I mean, skateboards have a very small built-in lifespan. A skateboard wears out quickly. Not only that, but it wears out your shoes almost by design. So you're constantly buying new things. So one has to be careful when one says skateboarding is anti-capitalist. But I do think that there is in the sort of natural ecosystem of what skaters call a session, which is being in a shared space, everyone riding skateboards, doing different things, interacting in various ways, ignoring each other in various ways. Within a session, I think there is undoubtedly something there that is interested in something beyond the market. And by that, I really truly mean beyond the idea that one thing is more valuable than something else. I think skateboarding has a built-in sliding scale of support and love that marks it as a totally unique thing to me in this world. Like, I think there's something magical there.
It's a perfect way to segue into saying to buy the
oh, yeah,
book.
please buy my book.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Thanks, Kyle, for writing an amazing book.
Thank you, Bing.
And
thank you, everyone, very much for this.
Yeah.
you.